WLW. So Iowa, here we go again. You start talking about Iowa, you know it has to do with elections. Ground zero for grassroots politics because they're first in the nation. And somebody out there, this is interesting. We're starting to see a lot more paid crowds show up. And in this case, they showed up for a man who wants to be the next president and our own JD Vance. So a lobbyist with deep ties to Iowa's governor. There's a text message sent out offering $100 a head to fill seats at a JD Vance rally there. And she is Victoria Churchill. She's a political reporter at the Daily Mail. I enjoy the Daily Mail and her stuff. Victoria, welcome back. How you been?
Hey, always great to be on with you, Scott. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. So this happened in Des Moines. There's a congressman by the name of Zach Nunn who is there, and the text message was sent out by an ethanol lobbyist offering money to contacts willing to attend. And here's a quote. I do some work for an ethanol company, and so if you're able to join, I'll give you $100. And for anyone you recruit, an additional $25. No limit on referrals. So this guy has got a thick roll of cash and has no problem handing it out. Now, you know, historically speaking, we've heard the cries from those on the right about paid activists showing up at protest rallies, Minneapolis, and a lot of the stuff has been confirmed, but it's certainly no surprise that Republicans are now leading into this, and whether they're paid supporters or paid protesters, it's cut from the same cloth.
Well, you know, what I want to point out about this is that this is a story that was originally reported in Iowa Starting Line, and then we actually went back and kind of did our own reporting about this at the Daily Mail. And the person that I talked to at the vice president's office said that they had kind of no knowledge or involvement about this. And, you know, that also other people that were there told me that if these people were paid to be there, it's probably a very small percentage of the attendees. So I think that is important to point out.
Yeah.
But I also think that, you know, going into the midterms, people are going to be talking about the enthusiasm level, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out for Republicans. You know, I think historically, and again, I've covered Trump and Vance events all across the country. In 2024, particularly, I actually did come to Ohio, to Cincinnati with the vice president a couple of times, traveling on what was then Trump Force 2. And, you know, I always thought that those crowds were organic, but I also do think that it's important to note incidents like this.
Yeah, I mean, does it really matter if it's 10 people or 100? It's certainly, we're not going to have a rally where everyone there is a paid plant, unless it's something so bizarre and so small that someone, and, you know, again, money is no object when it comes to politics, so it wouldn't surprise me someday we see, oh, but this isn't happening. We don't know if it's 10 or 100 or 1,000, as the case may be. We have no idea, no way to find out, do we?
No, not other than, you know, what we get told by our sourcing, which, of course, you know, we check and we double check and we verify.
In that case, too, because I've heard the president mentioned it a few times, I don't know if JD Vance has or not, but about how they're paid operatives on the left that show up and make it look like they're supporting a cause. And quite honestly, I mean, we've, the fact check shows it out. There's companies online that will advertise their wares and say, you know, hire someone or hire a group of people to show up to your next event, whether it's a political rally or a protest, and we'll show up there. And it's been going on for a while now. Do we know how far back this goes?
You know, I can't give you an exact date, but I am sure that it's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, top of my head, I think even back as early as, or as late rather, I guess, as maybe 2007. I think I remember hearing about like a union. I think it was a union that was hiring non-members recruited from homeless shelters, and they were paying them like $8 or $10 an hour to picket construction sites because they couldn't get enough union workers to show up to do the job. So, you know, while there's a will, there's a way, I guess. But the takeaway here is, all right, now do we start looking at events differently now, knowing that politicians, both sides of the aisle, pay people to show up to support them? Does that kind of change the narrative somewhat in your mind?
You know, as somebody that, like I said, has gone to a bunch of these events and has talked to attendees, I think that is kind of probably the most genuine way to feel that out and to root that out. You know, of course, not everybody's going to want to talk to media at these events, but I think those that are there for, you know, maybe not organically or probably few and far between. I've seen lots of enthusiasm, you know, for both Republicans and Democrats in my travels. But I also do want to say that I think historically crowd sizes have been bigger for Republicans at events I've attended. You know, I did attend, on the flip side, I did attend Kamala Harris's launch event in Philadelphia where she announced Tim Walz as her vice presidential nominee. that was a pretty packed event for the Democrats. But I think throughout the rest of the campaign, it was a fairly slim attendance in terms of, people that were just there by themselves. There were lots of groups, lots of union members. I can remember in one particular instance for Kamala Harris, there was an event at a community college, and they had a electrical vehicle maintenance shop or something along the likes of that, and they had quite a few union members that were there supporting that. She used it to kind of roll out part of her economic agenda, so that makes sense why those people were there. But yeah, like I said, I think and I also do want to say that, again, from what I remember, lots of the Harris events that I attended were packed into smaller venues. And so that is kind of another thing to think about, right? Is like the perception of crowd sizes. So, if you have a 8,000 person venue and you fill it with 10,000 people versus you pick a 13,000 person venue, that's going to look very different if it's, a third empty versus overflowing 2,000 people outside.
Yeah,
so,
you pack it, make the difference up. It makes sense. I mean, are you going to get you're going to spend $1 million on that one photo op, on that one event? If you're an ethanol lobbyist, probably not. But if you can get a third of the crowd there, that's probably doable, because these guys got a lot of money and they were throwing stacks of cash around at people to show up. We don't know how many showed up at the Vance event, but, still, it's a point of contention. And I think as a voter, you need to know that some people are there are paid actors. I think some of the backlash from this, from JD Vance's side, about how, it's funny, the guy who was handing the money out said he works for an ethanol company, and Vance talked about ethanol from the stage the same day. I don't think that's quid pro quo in a sense. I'll get your take on it, simply because, you're there for an event and it's ethanol is big in Iowa. Of course, you're going to talk about that. Yeah, I suppose you can make a case and go, well, do they pay the vice president to speak about that? No, generally the host is going to get mentioned, and there's going to be some discussion about what it is and what businesses is they're in that got them there in the first place.
Right, absolutely. I mean, for example, I was at an event with the vice president in North Carolina, again, back when he was the nominee, where he talked at a firearms manufacturing facility just outside of, where the Golden Knights are at in North Carolina. And, of course, he talked about firearms. So campaign operatives pick these venues to talk about the industries that they care about, but also the industries that support them. And so I think it makes sense why he was talking about ethanol in Iowa. Right. I worked in Iowa back in 2019, 2020, and I can tell you even back then that was a big issue. And even when they had the 2016 campaign as well, I remember working with an operative who was, working there in 2019, 2020. And he was telling me back when there was the nomination cycle that he was hired by ethanol lobbies, a completely different person, not the person involved in this. Just want to make that clear. But just, somebody else in Iowa that had been hired by ethanol companies in 2016 to talk to every single major campaign that came through town about that issue, because it is so big for the state. So I know that, that's been a focus in Iowa for at least a decade.
She's a political reporter at the Daily Mail. It's Victoria Churchill on the Scott Sloan Show, 700 WLW, with the Iowa 2820 Republican primary. Of course, Iowa was the first state in that, and JD Vance speaking there the other day. And it came out that the person sponsoring essentially the event, big supporter of ethanol, and was paying people to show up. We don't know how many, but again, we've seen this with progressives. It's certainly expected if one side's doing it, the other's going to follow suit. You've covered grassroots politics. We've been talking about. Is there a difference in your mind between a lobbyist bussing in paid bodies and a campaign bussing in volunteers who are asked to attend? That seems like a fine line.
Well, again, I don't even really think that this guy was a primary organizer of the event. I think he was just somebody that supported the issue. So I don't want to make that clear, at least from the reporting that, I've done and I've seen. But, I think it's interesting because these issue groups are very powerful, again, both on the left and the right, whether it's gun groups and pro-life groups on the right, and it's, labor groups and, pro-abortion groups turn out. And I think a big part of campaigns is working with organizations that align with your values and saying, hey, I need this event to be well attended. And so I think it makes sense that people do this. Again, the payment is kind of the potentially questionable part here. But again, I don't really think that this is a big impact necessarily on this. And, even if you look at some of the pictures that came out of Iowa, this was exactly a week ago now, there are just some guys in like a E15 hats and shirts. And, it's not like a third of the crowd or anything.
Yeah,
so I think that is important to note here.
Right. But I think it's, when we see something like this, if they feel there's value and it works, we're just going to see more of it and it's going to be more frequent. And now do we have something that's more like manufactured momentum being the new normal? And if that's a symptom or a strategy, I don't know.
I don't think it's necessarily a strategy going forward, but I do think that this is something that I will continue to look out for, whether it's with the top of the ticket or lower down ticket events. Just as a reporter, I have been at some events for some smaller candidates where you can tell that half the crowd that's there was the media, where, they didn't necessarily have that enthusiasm, but I'm not quite sure if that extends to folks like the vice president.
Victoria, I think, I think optics are what we're talking about here, and it matters more than authentic voter enthusiasm. And it sets up things, I guess, maybe in a voter's mind long before that first ballot is cast. This is more political theater is what it is. And maybe not replacing, but supplementing real, authentic feels for a candidate or a cause.
Yeah, I think politics has always been around about theater, right? I remember in college learning about, the whistle stop tours that used to take place for the presidential campaign. So I think the optics have definitely been a big part of it, but definitely especially more now since we kind of do live in more of a 24/7 media environment, right? I don't necessarily think that, before 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that I, as a DC reporter, would have necessarily been covering an event in Iowa that was, one that I didn't necessarily attend. So I think that definitely does speak to, perception becomes reality. And I do remember, particularly with the race against Kamala Harris, that I think the Democrats did like to jab at Trump in crowd sizes. And particularly with the president, that is something that he keeps a very close eye on, going back to his first campaign and his inauguration.
I think that seems bigger to Trump than most everyone else. Like I don't look at the crowd size and go, it depends. If you have it at the National Mall is much different than, I don't know, some sort of aircraft hangar in Iowa. It's different size. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of the National Mall, I'm sure you've seen those pictures, right? All about perception and reality about everything that they've got planned going on here for 4th of July. And, Trump's birthday is going to be coming up in, I guess under a month now, June 14th. Lots of events that they're planning here for the administration with Trump's birthday is going to be the same day as the UFC fight. Mm-hmm. So lots of crowds, I'm sure, will be coming to DC. I know I'm sticking around town for most of the summer. I don't want to miss any of it.
$1 million ringside seats, $1 million ticket ringside. How many are you buying?
Shoot, I think that's a little bit out of my budget, Scott. Maybe if I get lucky and I can call in some favors, that might get me there.
$1 million.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I actually do want to point out that I think a lot of those seats are actually going to groups like veterans. So,
sure.
I think there is an upside there as well.
Yeah, it's a good talk. Like, oh, my God, $1 million, who's paying that? Probably not many people, if any. Victoria Churchill over at Daily Mail, political reporter. Thanks for the insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Always glad to be back.
Yep. We'll talk again soon, my friend. Thank you.